Hello, anatomist. Today we are going to do an overview of the skeletal system. So, if you remember last time, we kind of went through some of the different systems, and one of them was the skeletal system. And it's basically all the bones and ligaments that support and protect and provide the framework for your body. It also stores inorganic salts like calcium and magnesium, and houses your blood-forming tissues. In the skeletal system, we can break it down to two histology types of bone. So you have compact bone and you have spongy bone. Typically, you're going to find spongy bone at the ends of your long bones, in the middle of your flat bones, and then everything is lined in compact bone. Especially the shaft of your long bones, you're going to find a lot of compact bone in there. Just looking at this bone, there's a couple things you need to know off of it. One is the histology types. Two is the apophyses. They're going to be the ends of the bones. So you have your proximal apophyse. This is going to be the one closest to the body. Your distal apophysis is going to be the one furthest away. And then the shaft of the bone you call the diaphysis. Something else you can see in this is there are two types of marrow. So we have red marrow up here in the apophyses and yellow marrow in the shaft. Yellow marrow stores fats, while your red marrow is going to be your blood-forming marrow. So it's going to make your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets here at the ends of the bones. So of the two histology types, the compact and the spongy bone, they look a little different. So when you look at compact bone, you will see that it is organized in these rings. One of these ring sets is called an osteon. And this is basically the functional unit of compact bone. Is going to be these osteons. Something else you can see in this are these circles that are associated with those osteons. These are concentric lamellae. Lamellae is just a fancy word for layers. I really like to watch like the Great British Baking Show, and you'll hear them talk occasionally about laminations, especially in pastries. Laminations is just talking about layers. Lamellae is talking about layers. Concentric means they're growing out like a ring, right? Then you also have perforating canals. Sometimes in pictures you might see these called Volkmann's canals. And it gets blood to these central canals, sometimes called Haversian canals. Then we have a wrapping of your bone called the periosteum. So periosteum. And it's going to have a fibrous layer and an osteogenic layer because your bones actually grow from the outside. And you'll talk more about that in physiology if you haven't had physiology yet. So within that compact bone, if we look back at this picture, you can kind of see these black little spider web things. Inside those is where you're going to have your mature bone cells. These are osteocytes. Bone is living. That's why when you break bone, it hurts, right? It's not like hair that's dead. So you're going to have blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, you're going to have nerves, you're going to have living cells, osteocytes, inside the bone. There are two other cell types that we see associated with bone and bone formation and destruction. Those are going to be osteoblast, which help build bone. And so if we look out here, your osteoblast would be in this osteogenic layer. And then you have osteoclast that destroy bone. A lot of that osteoclast you're going to find over here near the spongy bone. So your osteocyte, your mature bone cell, is inside the osteon. You will also see that there's some space around this cell. So your osteocyte is contained within this space called the lacuna. So the lacuna helps to protect the cell so it doesn't get squished out by bone. You also have these little canals that help to connect the osteocyte to the blood and to other osteocytes so they can talk to each other. These little canals are called caniculi, which literally means little canals. So if we look at a compact bone slide, what all can you identify in this slide? Well, we have this thing right here. That's going to be that central canal or that haversian canal. You can see the concentric layers going around it, so the lamellae. You can also see the lacunae, where the osteocytes would be. If you look close, you can also see those little canals radiating out from the osteocyte. So you can see the caniculae. So we can see the central canal, the lamellae, the lacuna. You can't actually see the osteocyte in here because it's not stained for that, but you can see the caniculi. Spongy bone looks a little bit different. So here you can see a trabeculae of the spongy bone. This is going to be your functional unit of the spongy bone, this trabeculae. You can see an endosteum, and then your bone marrows, a megakaryocyte. These are the cells that actually make platelets. So this looks really different from compact bone. But you can still see, maybe, that kind of looks like bone. And if you look at this picture, you can see the trabeculae here. We still have caniculi, letting your osteocytes talk to each other and get nutrients. Here you can see some of those osteoclasts eating the bone. And here's that endosteum, so the inside of the bone. So you have a periosteum on the outside, an endosteum on the inside. So the functional unit of spongy bone isn't going to be an osteon, it's going to be trabeculae. But you can see still it does have some lamellae. It's just not as well formed like the osteons in your compact bone. So we can name bone based on the histology, either compact or spongy. We also have other structural ways to name the bones. So you have bones that are called flat bones, bones that are sutural bones or wormian bones, bones that are irregular, bones that are short, bones that are sesamoid, and bones that are long. Can you picture in your mind what you think a long bone would look like? Or a short bone? How about a flat bone? Well, flat bones aren't flat. So the parietal bone is a good example of a flat bone. Actually, most of the bones in your skull and the cranium are good examples of flat bones. What makes a flat bone is that you're going to have this layer of compact, a layer of spongy, sometimes called dipole in a flat bone, and then a layer of compact. And so it kind of looks almost like an Oreo with compact, spongy, compact. And these bones are sometimes called dermal bones because they're formed in the dermis versus your long bones, which are formed from hyaline cartilage framework that we're not going to get into because this isn't physiology. But flat bones aren't technically flat. Your sutural bones are going to be bones that are found in the sutures. So here would be a sutural bone. Sometimes they're called wormian bones because if you look at these sutures, they're really windy. And some of those bones come out looking very windy, like a worm. Your irregular bones, a vertebrae is a great example of an irregular bone. If you look at it, it has a very unique shape with all these little processes coming off. Your short bones, man, they're short. And so when you look at them, they are short, boxy bones. Your sesamoid bones are going to be bones that are formed in tendons. we name only one sesamoid bone because pretty much everybody has it, and that's the patella. But you can also get sesamoid bones in the tendons in your wrist or in your ankles or anywhere else you have tendons. You just get ossification inside that tendon, which causes these sesamoid bones. But since there's a lot of variation in if you get them and where you get them and how it looks, that we don't include that in the total 206 bones that we have. But we do include the patella. We also don't include any of the sutural bones. None of these have fancy names like the patella or the parietal bone, because again, there's a lot of variation in if you have them and where you have them and what they are. Then the last type is your long bones. These are the bones you probably know of. So like the humerus would be this bone up here in your arm. Your femur is a long bone. Your radius, your ulna, tibia, fibula, all those are long bones. So how can we tell these different bones apart? Well, they look different, right? Maybe some of the carpal bones you'll be like, I can't tell the difference there. But trust me, they look different. And those differences comes from different bone markings. So some general bone markings would be like a process. If you look back here, you have the mastoid process on the temporal bone, where you have this projection or bump. If you can see this right here, this little pokey one, that's the styloid process. And then you have a ramus. That's what I'm outlining here in blue. It's going to be a bone extension that makes an angle. So if you see your mandible comes and then it comes up, right here where you get that bend, that is the ramus of the mandible. And then next ones we're going to talk about are going to be ones that are for ligament or tendon attachment, so where muscles attach or where bones attach to other bones. The first one is the trochanter up here on the femur. You're only going to find trochanters on the femur. You have your greater and lesser. And you'll have a better picture of this later when we get to the femur proper, when we talk about the appendicular skeleton. But trochanters, it's just a really large, rough projection. There's a lot of muscle and ligament attachment there to hold the weight of the body. And you also have a line right here. If you look at this little thing, this is the linea aspera, or the line on the femur. The next one is a tuberosity. If you reach down right below your knee, you can probably feel this rough projection. That is your tibial tuberosity. And if you continue down that, you will feel your shin bone. That is a crest. So it's your tibial crest, that shin bone right there, the bony part. So tuberosity is a rough projection. A crest is a prominent ridge. You also have one up on your hip bone. So right here you have an iliac crest. Okay, so the next we're going to talk about is a tubercle, or a small rounded projection. If you look right here on the humerus, you have the greater tubercle and the lesser tubercle. And then you have spines, so pointed process. Right here on the ischium, you have an ischial spine. And the next group we're going to talk about is the bone markings for bone attachment, so bone-to-bone attachment. You have the head, which is going to be right here on the humerus, this rounded portion. On the femur right here, this rounded portion. And heads are connected to their bone by a neck. So if you look right here on the femur, you can see how that gets really narrow right there. That is the neck of the femur. The humerus is a little weird. So it has two necks. You have an anatomical neck where it gets kind of narrow right here, right after the head. But then you'll also see it gets narrowed down here. This is the surgical neck. So the humerus has an anatomical neck and a surgical neck. They call this one the surgical neck because if you're going to break your humerus at one of the necks, it's not going to be that one. It's typically right down here. And then we have condyles. If you look down here on the femur where it meets up with the tibia, you can see these round, smooth areas where the bones come together. Those are condyles. And next up we have the trochleae. This is kind of like a pulley-shaped process. It's kind of grooved. You're going to see on the ulna, when we talk about that, where it meets up with the humerus, it has a trochlear notch, or a notch for this trochleae so it can fit into that. And lastly, on bone-to-bone attachments, you have facets. Facets are going to be these flat articular surfaces where two bones come into contact. If you look right here on this thoracic vertebrae, you can see a facet right here. It's kind of just flat with a little bit of a ring around it, and then two more right there and right there where the ribs meet up with those thoracic vertebrae. We also have bone depressions. So a fossa is going to be a shallow depression where a muscle lay. So if you look right here on the ilium, you have these two depressions. If you look at the scapula, it has three. It has one anterior and two posterior, where your subscapularis, infraspinatus, and supraspinatus lay. And then a sulcus is going to be a narrow groove. This is our humerus again with your greater and lesser tubercle. And then you have this intertubicular sulcus. So this sulcus that runs between those two tubercles. And lastly, on bone markings, we have holes. So holes, the first one is a foramen. Foramens are going to be round passageways for blood vessels and nerves. So if it looks round, it's probably a foramen. Fissures are elongated clefts. So if you look right here inside the orbit, you'll see two fissures, a superior and an inferior fissure. A meatus is a canal or a passageway through the bone. The only one that I really know of is your external auditory meatus or acoustic meatus. That's your ear hole, right? And it goes until it reaches the tympanum. And then a sinus or an antrum is just a chamber in the bone. It's typically filled with air. You have your frontal sinus right here, your sphenoidal back here. So, we just ran through all those different types of bones and bone markings. This is how you tell them apart, okay? And so, on a quiz or a test, I can ask you about stuff like, what is this process on the skull, and have an arrow pointing to something, and you have to tell me that it is the mastoid process or the styloid process, depending on where I pointed to. Same with tuberosities or trochanters. You'd be like, what is this big roughened projection on the femur? You'd be like, that's the greater trochanter, or something of that sort. Alright. With that is our brief overview on the skeleton. Next, we're going to pop in and talk about the axial skeleton specifically, so the head, the spinal column, and the rib cage. So digest those bones, and we'll pick up again shortly.